Hi, and welcome to Homo Ludens, the channel on history and board games. For this episode, I decided to invite Stephen Rangazas, once again, the designer of the soon-to-be shipped The British Way, a coin multipack about the collapse of the British Empire. But the reason I invited Stephen today is that I want to talk about his new project, the Guerrilla Generation, that was recently added to GMT's P500. And I wanted to talk about this project specifically, but also to talk about the depiction of counterinsurgency in board games, so more specifically about the coin series, but also that depiction beyond the coin series and what it could be in the future. Stephen, you came prepared for that discussion with a presentation in 3 parts. So we'll talk about the philosophy of the coin series, the Guerrilla Generation itself, and modeling coin without coin. I will add links in the description for people who want to navigate into the different section of that discussion. And I would say, let's just jump into it. So first of all, thanks for being here, Stephen. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. I'm happy to be back. I have to design multi-packs to get back onto the show. So we'll see how many more times I have to design one just to desperately get onto Homo Ludens again.
We still have 2 episodes to record or stream of the British Way campaign with Joe. We should be back at it, I think, early May. So we should finish this in June. Are you excited about the British Way being shipped right now?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited to see how people react to the multi-pack structure. I mean, the player aids has gotten an advanced copy and they seem to be losing their minds, which is nice to see. But we'll see if other people have the same reaction. And I think if anyone is kind of wondering about whether the multi-packs are the right fit for them versus the main volumes, I think the first part of our discussion today might actually help them decide that. So we'll see if people's reactions are the same to the differences I'm about to talk about today.
Yeah, I think it's exciting to see that. So the players say they got a copy because they are going to demo it at the convention. If we're lucky enough, Joe and I should be able to demo it also at PunchCon later in May. So our fingers crossed that we'll get some boxes before then. And I'm also looking forward to see the reactions from the players to this slightly different approach on how to use the coin system, which I think is very exciting and probably one of the most exciting things that is happening within the coin ecosystem, I would say. As I said, you came here prepared with a presentation because we had some back and forth. You had a lot of thoughts, and we thought it would be the opportunity for this discussion for you to put those thoughts almost on paper, at least on video, but you actually structured the deck. So I guess maybe we should jump into it and for people to know. So there is this structure, but it's going to be still a conversation. So I will jump in. I will ask the question. So I'm already sorry about that, but that's I think that's the way we're gonna go with it. I'll let you jump into the introduction.
Yeah, so I think as this introductory slide indicates, we're going to talk about the Guerrilla Generation, so that way I can sell some product. But really, we're here to talk about, I think, more broadly, modeling counterinsurgency, as Fred said, without the coin system. And so Fred already covered a lot of this, but so just to give some background about me, I'm a PhD candidate at George Washington University, and I study civil wars and insurgencies, and particularly the use of violence against civilians during civil wars. The British Way, which you see here, is, as Fred said, charging at the end of April. I think Gene said April 25th. And so this should be shipping, he said, within a week of April 25th. So it'll be very soon coming out. And then Sovereign of Discord is my second coin product. And that's actually going to the printer at the end of April. So if you can't tell, Joe and I have been very busy, especially since I am the developer on the just announced yesterday Resisting Revolution, Joe's expansion for Cuba Libre. So in other words, I've got a lot of experience in terms of the academic literature on counterinsurgency, but also the specific system that GMT sells. So as Fred kind of alluded to, I think I'm going to try to do 3 things today with this back and forth. First, I want to talk about what I see as the 2 main philosophies of the coin series between the main volumes that were really designed originally by Volker Runke and then the multi-packs, which I'm putting forth. And this is, I should mention, motivated by Stuart, who's Dr. Crossbow on the Homo Ludens Discord server, asked some really good questions. I'm hoping that this answers them for him. And then second, I want to talk about 3 kind of broad themes of the Guerrilla Generation as a whole with a pack, which is kind of similar to the interview we had about the British Way, but a little bit more briefly done. Yeah. And then I think that the majority of what I want to talk about today is this idea of modeling coin without coin. Like, where could we go in the future with our counterinsurgency designs? So starting off, so I think that a lot of people have attempted to define what is coin or what exactly is coin, often by an appeal to the mechanics. Oh, it's the card activation system, or it's the population support on the board. And there's, these very like minutia definitional struggles between what is ICS and what is coin. And I think that we should actually step back. Oh, go
Maybe
ahead.
one thing, Stephen, to say, because we're talking about stuff that people might not know about.
Yeah.
So most of the people will know the coin series. So the series that is was introduced by Ande and Abyss. Maybe one of the most well-known game is Cuba Libre, and ICS is a new series for irregular conflict series that was introduced by GMT. The first one being Vijay Nagara, the second one being Jest, the third one being Cross Bronx Expressway. So the idea that some of the concept of coin can be reapplied in different topics, and that they decided to create that specific series that is on the side. So when we're going to be mentioning, we're going to talk a lot about coin and a lot about ICS, and now you know what those two things are.
Yes, that's a good correction, so people know I have a remote idea of what I'm talking about. So I think that we should, though, step back and try to think about, broadly speaking, how does the coin series in terms of its products address this question, which is, what is the most useful way to explore irregular conflicts? Because I think that the main volumes that you'll find in the coin series, or at least the ones originally designed by Volko, have a very different answer to that than, say, the multi-packs. And those would be what I see as the two main kind of competing philosophies of how do we answer this question. So if we think of the Runke model, if you look at what he says in the early volumes, and particularly in the design notes, and also what he says in interviews, really the overall argument here is that irregular conflict is always a diverse multi-faction struggle. In other words, the multiplayer aspect of coin is fundamental to the argument of how we're going to look at irregular conflicts. And so another way of putting that is that the coin series is viewing conflicts through a multi-faction lens. That when we apply the coin series to a topic, we're always going to try to look at more than a two-sided affair. What are these other actors that might be present that wouldn't necessarily fit into the classic mold of a government versus an insurgent? And one thing I want to really stress here is that I think that often the specific mechanics across these volumes may change about whether we're going to do ancient Gaul and Falling Sky and represent things as tribal allegiance with disc, or whether we're going to be, in modern day Colombia and do support versus opposition markers. But the key thing is the multi-faction lens, I think. And I think that the most explicit articulation you see of that is actually Volko's use of the quote by David Kilcullen in the Andean Abyss design notes. Counterinsurgency is fundamentally a competition between many groups seeking to mobilize the population in support of its agenda. And I've italicized here the important part, which is that counterinsurgency is always more than two-sided. So that is the argument that I think the coin series is really applying to all these settings. And so if you think about how, as players and designers, we should think about the Runke model, it's that we're asking ourselves, what do we learn if we explore playable actors outside of a two-sided conflict model? And so there's all sorts of, for instance, board games in the wargaming space that do use that two-sided model that are very interesting. So, for instance, I've depicted here Vietnam, American Revolution, Caesar and Gaul. And what coin is doing is saying, if we spread the agency to other players, what dynamics are revealed that we otherwise wouldn't see in, for instance, Hearts and Minds or Washington's War? And I think that that's really how you should evaluate whether or not a coin game succeeds or not. But as we know, coin has evolved pretty dramatically from Volko's original conception of it. And I think that you'll sometimes hear people say that, for instance, Root is inspired by coin or something like that. And I think that it's important to recognize that I think Root does adopt the Runke model of this applying, if we're going to understand irregular conflict, we have to apply a multi-faction lens. But of course, it does not really adopt any of the mechanics. So we can, in other words, take Volko's viewpoint, or David Kilcullen, we might say, his viewpoint of conflict, and not even use the mechanics of coin. Alternatively, there are games even in the coin series that I would argue use the mechanics of coin, but don't actually adopt the Runke model. And a good example of this is Colonial Twilight, which is it depicts Algeria, I think even quite reasonably, as a two-sided struggle. And I think you could think of Colonial Twilight almost more as Brian taking some of his earlier work on Algeria and translating it into coin mechanics, rather than really an articulation of the Volko model. Now, I will note that if you go onto Brian's website, he does have a 4-player variant to Colonial Twilight, which we might think of as more of like if you did apply the Runke model to Algeria. what would we essentially learn? But that's yeah.
What are the other faction that
So
he has in this?
he splits it each side into internal, external. So you're basically like the army and the Pied Noir inside of Algeria versus kind of the French and the civilian government, and then you're either the internal, external factions of the FLN.
Okay, so he separated ILN and FLN. Like you have the more political arm and the more military arm for the insurgents. And okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
I haven't actually tried that variant yet, even though I probably should. However, then this other guy came along whose last name also ends in R. And so we have now the Rangazas model. I would argue that the multi-packs are not just a collection of games in a box, but are really trying to offer an alternative answer to that question of what is the most useful way to explore irregular conflict with the coin series. This arose out of a couple of concerns I had with the main volumes. Now, as somebody who studies conflict, I had one big advantage over a lot of other people in terms of evaluating the coin series, in that I learned about all these conflicts outside of the coin series themselves. And I think that one struggle that we often have in wargaming, especially on obscure topics, is that people are learning about the topic that they have to, somewhat evaluate its usefulness from the game itself. And so having learned about a lot of these topics in the main coin volumes, I think that one thing you'll see, whether you think that the system is this multi-faction lens is useful or not, is that there are just massive modeling costs for using this multiplayer approach. Now, one that I think is most obvious is that complexity gets a lot higher with an asymmetric multiplayer game. A lot of people really struggle with Cuba Libre, but I think that potentially more important modeling costs are in terms of abstraction and agency. So in terms of abstraction, to actually make an asymmetric multiplayer game legible, you often have to heavily abstract other processes that you might otherwise depict. And related to that, to actually apply this multi-faction lens to these conflicts, we often have to spread out our agency in the game, just like we have a complexity budget. I often think that there's an agency budget. In other words, we have to remove agency from sometimes what we might think of as the two main actors, like the government and the insurgents, and really lift up other actors. And in some conflicts, that's going to make sense. And in others, I would argue that that's less useful.
So just to be clear, what you're saying is that to make all factions interesting, we're going to have to spread agency for every player to have something interesting to do at the table and have valuable interactions with others. And one of the potential negative side effects is that you're going to over-evaluate, or in the model, over-evaluate the importance of a specific faction in the conflict. Maybe do you have tangible examples of that we can talk about so people can wrap their head around? And I guess we're going to talk about Cuba Libre.
So let me give you a good example from Cuba Libre. If you read Havana Nocturna, which is a book about the mafia in Cuba that the game designer even recommends, you'll see that the mafia did do a lot of activity in Cuba. But I'll tell you right now, if you go read the cutting-edge empirical literature on the Cuban Revolution, it's not uncommon to read an entire book without the mafia even being mentioned. Because the bottom line is that yes, the mafia were there, and yes, there were interactions with the other factions, but is it really true that they interacted as much as the July 26th or the government or even the urban underground? No. And so the question is that, or for instance, did the mafia, or what the game calls the syndicate, actually have an alternative vision of Cuba compared to the July 26th and the government? And the answer is probably no. And so it's not that. The question is does adding the syndicate give us enough new, interesting dynamics that helps us understand the Cuban Revolution? Or would we have been better off having taken some of that agency and complexity and fleshing out, for instance, the July 26th movement so that it doesn't play like the FARC or the Shining Path would, where it's just scattering terror all across the map? Or whether we could have, for instance, shown the dynamics between the actual urban version of the July 26th, which is actually far bigger and in some sense more important, versus the rural July 26th, which I don't think that the game particularly does well at doing.
But couldn't you argue, if I'm following your argument, so spreading this agency budget that you were talking about, I like this idea, makes it so that you maybe make a fourth faction that is maybe not as relevant as it actually is historically. But couldn't you argue that this multifaceted approach to depicting counterinsurgency still works, but just has to be more flexible in the way it does it? And rather than being strictly a 4-player affair, sometimes it could be a 5-player one, and sometimes it could be a 3-player one, but still be true to that original vision that Volko had. And I'm asking this because we're going to see more 3-player coin games coming up. There is the People Power that is finally going to be out, but before that we had All Bridges Burning, and we can expect more to come. So do you think that it's this criticism necessarily around agency, is it really fundamental, or is this just a matter of adjustment to specific games?
Well, I think that this gets to the second bullet point here, which is I think I 100% agree with Volko and David Kilcullen that coin is in some sense always a more than two-sided affair.
Yeah.
And so that's what I think is the real biggest contribution of coin more than anything else in terms of what Volko has given us, is that it's forcing people to think about other major actors outside of maybe the two most obvious ones. The big question, though, is do I need to make those other actors players or mechanics? We should always, in other words, have inclusion. The question is whether we should grant agency, because agency is scarce. And so we have to think about, that's a fine line. And so sometimes I absolutely agree that for conflicts, your 3 might be best or 5 might be best or something like that. But that's what I think designers should really be asking themselves, is where's the line between players and mechanics? And we'll get a little bit more into this when I talk about what coin can and cannot do in the last part of the discussion. And so that, I basically have already answered the third bullet point, that sometimes, like you could, for instance, make all the games in the British way multiplayer. The question is whether you should do that. And that I'm not exactly convinced or that necessarily adding additional player roles would actually add that much to what we would learn about the conflict, even though it would add, I would argue, a lot of cost in terms of modeling. And so,
interestingly, actually, in your games, the British way, going back to where you're saying about should it be players or mechanics, you actually went the way of showing that there are other actors, but using mechanics. Like I'm thinking, for example, about the first one on Palestine. Like you have this internal tension for the insurgents and the level of support that they're going to get from other organizations. It is modeled in there. You see it. You see that there is more than 2 actors, but I think it is a good illustration of your second bullet point here. So that's the approach that you took: use more mechanics and limit it to the two core main actors of the conflict, and just having 2 players, right?
Yeah, exactly. Because if you had added so what Fred's referring to is the Jewish group Haganah, which is actually much larger than the more violent groups that I directly give player agency to in the game. And the reason what would happen if you made Haganah a player is that you would fundamentally change the nature of the conflict in Palestine, because Haganah wasn't really trying to directly beat Britain. It was trying to prepare to fight the Palestinian Arabs once the British left. And so if you were going to do a game on the struggle between the long-term idea of how you transition from British Mandatory Palestine to Israel and what that's going to look like in terms of Palestinians' place in that Israel, yes, you would need to grant Haganah agency, and that would fundamentally change the game, though, from this narrow look. And so those are kind of, I think, is a great example to bring up of this big question in designers' minds of player versus mechanic.
Yeah.
And so they just end here, but like those are all critiques. So that's not an alternative model. In terms of having an alternative model, I would argue that the multi-packs, though, instead of offering a multi-faction lens, are about offering a comparative politics lens. And that within a box, I'm going to give you a very carefully chosen set of conflicts. And I'm going to encourage you to basically make comparisons and contrasts between those topics to help you formulate more general ideas about counterinsurgency and insurgency. And so, like Volko, I also have a fancy quote. And so Staitis Clevis, who's authored The Logic of Violence of Civil War, which if you really want to understand civil wars, this is basically a required text now. I mean, I can't really emphasize how influential his work has been on the field of civil wars and political science. He argues that it is often forgotten that theory building should be grounded in credible intuitions. And examples from a broad comparative canvas serve to demonstrate the credibility of each and every building block in this theoretical edifice. Now, that's a lot of fancy social science jargon. What is Clevis trying to say here, which is that if we want to develop general ideas in our mind about insurgency and counterinsurgency, the best thing we can do is be familiar with a very broad set of cases, so that way we can help identify what is specific and what is general about those processes. And that is really the philosophy of the coin series, of the coin multi-packs. And so to conclude here, I think the multi-packs and the main volumes are trying to answer two very different approaches to this kind of what is the most useful way to explore regular conflicts. I would argue that the main volumes follow what we would call in the social sciences a deductive approach. It's assuming that these conflicts are always multi-sided and we have to give them agency. And then we're seeing what we learn if we do. Like, what do we actually learn differently if we actually grant more roles, more factions, player roles, for instance, rather than units? And I think that the multi-packs, though, are more of an inductive approach, where I'm going to give you a whole set of civil wars in every box. And I want you to try to guide you through learning some general ideas from looking at all those different civil wars in comparison.
I would like to talk about this more specifically, and we'll go back to the slides afterwards. I think it's really interesting the way you say that the multipacks are changing the model and this comparative political lens. I think it makes a lot of sense, and I think in the case of the British way, that was the thing that I was the most fascinated about, to see how the British Empire resolved those crises differently, and I think that's a really great way to see it in different contexts. But as you said, for this to work, you need to carefully pick the topics that you're selecting. And in the multi-pack, you're choosing 4 emergencies. There are more than those 4. And it's the same case for the Guerrilla Generation. There are other topics that you decided not to cover. How did you decide what to cover, not to cover, or what to include within those multi-packs to make this multifaceted political comparative lens as efficient as possible? What's your thought process behind this to actually make this new model work?
Just like with an inductive theory in political science, the idea is that there is a broad general theme to every multi-pack. I think that is essential to make a multi-pack really work, and that will guide you about what are the 4 conflicts that are most useful to create the nicest comparison set of cases for comparison. So the British way is all about really kind of centrally, what is the role of coercion in counterinsurgency? And we're going to take the British right after World War II because it's viewed that they're not very coercive, that they're really nice. And as David French says, they're actually nasty, but not nice. But they're nasty in very different ways. And so I picked the 4 conflicts where I think that really illustrated how they're nasty in different ways and at different degrees to help you figure out why, for instance, they might have been willing to use hideous amounts of coercion in Kenya and then not in Cyprus where they were under international spotlight, just to give away one of the potential And then in the Guerrilla Generation, as we'll talk about here in a second, the real central theme is about how do insurgents organize themselves differently. So for instance, I picked 4 insurgencies that I think operate very differently. And I want you to try to see, compare and contrast across those 4 models of insurgent. I shouldn't use model to confuse people, but 4 types of insurgent organizations. So, for instance, I did not include the Sandinista revolution, which is a very important conflict, but that does not necessarily serve, I think, the purpose as well as comparing, for instance, the Contras, a cross-border insurgency, with the FLN, which is a very restrained, popular-backed insurgency within a country. And so it's really about thinking in your mind, what is the overall kind of general topic that we're talking about, and then picking the most useful cases for that topic.
Okay. And I guess let's go back to the now that we talked about this, let's go back to the flow of your presentation.
Yes, and perfect timing. I mean, Fred is the king of segues. That now we've made it to the second part, which is let's talk a little bit about the Guerrilla Generation. And so now that I've explained to you kind of the philosophical difference between the multi-packs, let's give an example of a multi-pack, for instance. So I have to do this, even though I'm going to preface this right now that I'm not really going to talk about any of this mechanical specifics of the Guerrilla Generation. We're going to do a whole series of Inside GMT articles to talk about this. I just don't think that that's really that interesting to talk in this interview. Yeah.
I would say read the Inside GMT articles. They're going to be more detailed and more interesting. And probably when we'll have final art, I think we'll do the same thing as the British way, and we'll start a campaign where I get trashed by Joe across multiple games.
And so just to quickly answer what is different from those of you who go watch the British way interview if you haven't yet, and then you might be wondering what is different in the Guerrilla Generation. So the 3 big differences is, as we just talked about, the thematic focus is about insurgency, whereas the British way was really about counterinsurgency. I think it is a little bit higher complexity than the British way. And then the campaign scenario is going to be 2 conflicts side by side rather than seeing 4 sequentially. But I'm not going to go into any more detail than that. So on to the interesting stuff, which is the broad themes of the Guerrilla Generation. So the first big theme is this, I would say, the setting. So the Guerrilla Generation is about filling out our kind of set of cases of civil wars in Cold War Latin America. And you can think of civil wars in Cold War Latin America as almost being bookended by the 2 current coin games that exist in the region. Castro's insurgency in the 1950s, which really served as a model after he won to a lot of other groups that were kind of inspired by both the victory and also the writings of Castro and Che. And then at the other end of the spectrum, you have one of the actual lingering Cold War insurgencies that go into the 21st century is the FARC in Colombia. And you increasingly have this intersection between what started as kind of a leftist insurgency, but intersecting with the war on drugs. That becomes more important as you go into the 21st century. And so you can kind of see the 2 current volumes as these bookends of what we mean by civil wars in Cold War Latin America. And so let's add in the details. So after Castro won, all of these groups try to follow the FOCO model in rural areas, and it really didn't go well. And then kind of the end of those attempts was Che dying in Bolivia. And then the Guerrilla Generation starts the very next year in Uruguay. And in southern South America, they looked at this complete failure of Che in Bolivia and these other locations, and they said, in South America, increasingly people are living in the cities, so maybe we should try this in the cities. And so the first game is really on Uruguay in terms of exploring urban guerrillas. And then you have to fast forward to about the early 1980s for the other ones to start, because over the course of the 1970s, the urban guerrillas don't go very well. They basically are crushed by military regimes. And then in the 1970s, particularly in Central America, we see the launching of really massive conflicts in terms of, we're talking about major civil wars with much higher intensity than either the FOCOs or Castros in Cuba or the urban guerrillas. And part of those were inspired by the success of the Nicaraguan Revolution in the late 1970s. That was the other big success story of insurgencies in Latin America besides Castro that really motivated groups like in El Salvador and other places like in Guatemala, which is not actually in the Guerrilla Generation. And so we have these 2 big conflicts in Central America, and then it really ends with the Shining Path in Peru, which actually doesn't really fit into a Cold War scheme. The United States didn't really know what to make of them. And they actually started right after Peru's transition to democracy. So they're a very weird, highly centralized Marxist group. And at the end of their struggle, they're increasingly getting involved in the drug trade. So I see them as somewhat analogous to the themes that you're starting to see in Andean Abyss. So in other words, you can think of the Guerrilla Generation as kind of connecting the aftermath of the Cuban Revolution and feeding into the themes you might start seeing in Andean Abyss.
And just maybe for historical context and out of curiosity, when you're looking back into Foucault theory, why do you think it didn't generalize, apply well to the rest of Latin America? How come it was successful in Cuba and just didn't work in those other countries?
Well, I think the bottom line is it never worked in Cuba because they never did it in Cuba. Because Castro landed, and what you forgot about Cuba was that he had this massive underground organization that was really going out of their way to save Castro. They were funneling all these resources into the Sierra. They were also taking the brunt of Batista's repression. And so Batista didn't worry about Castro for almost a year. And the reason why is because they weren't doing anything really in the Sierra Mission. They weren't really launching attacks. They had a whole year to prepare. And 2 is because he was fighting the urban underground. I mean, the director almost killed him in Havana. And so in other words, Castro has this huge advantage, whereas him, in terms of constructing a narrative of how they won the war between him and Che, they created really a fiction that then other people wanted to emulate. And when they went off to these other countries, they showed up, and often the peasants didn't want anything to do with them. And so the peasants were like, all right, I'm immediately going to go to the local policeman because these guys just look like trouble to me. I don't understand anything that they're saying. Whereas one of the very crucial things that happened with Castro is when he first landed, he actually was pretty much rescued by a local bandit leader, a guy who's kind of referred to as the Lord of the Mountain in terms of the Sierra Maestra. And that guy allowed him to tap into peasant networks that he otherwise, as an outsider, probably never would have been able to. And so a lot of these leftist-oriented insurgencies where people come from urban areas or come from other areas of the country often need this was true of the CCP and also true in some sense of the Viet Minh, need local bandit leaders or at least local power brokers to actually tap them into peasant networks to be like, oh, you should actually trust these guys.
Yeah.
And so if you want to explore those dynamics, adjusted Ram.
I didn't ask the question for that.
Yeah.
But it's interesting to see that pendulum between the myth of Foucault and the countryside insurgency, and then the opposite side in Uruguay, where there is this strong focus in the urban one, and seeing that actually it's the articulation of the two that was pretty efficient.
Which I should quickly add on that point of the alternative in Uruguay is I think a lot of people forget that the urban guerrillas were trying to start what existed in Cuba, and that they were actually trying to create real fronts. So the Tupamaros actually repeatedly tried to use their success in the capital to create these rural fronts in Uruguay, and it just didn't do very well. And you actually do get to see that dynamic in the Guerrilla Generation Uruguay, and I think other games on the topic kind of leave that aspect out, that they really thought of the city preparation as getting you ready to go to the rural areas, and then that will be where you actually build up strength to defeat the state.
Yeah, and we actually talked about this with Joe in a podcast a while ago when because we were talking about this book. I don't remember the name of the guy, but from a guerrilla that inspired a lot of people in Uruguay about it was a manual of
it's like the urban manual, the mini manual of the urban guerrilla. So it's like Carlos Margarella or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And we're talking about him, and he does say this in his book, that urban guerrilla is just the starting point, that you actually need the support from the countryside to actually have a successful. So they were actually in theory aware of this, just in practice not really succeeding. Okay, but that makes sense. Great.
All right, so moving on to, I would say, the second broad theme is that I think that the Guerrilla Generation is really important for contextualizing our current existing Cold War games. So there's a lot of now there's at least a handful now global Cold War games having followed the success of Twilight Struggle. And I think that those games offer you a certain perspective, which is that of the superpower at the global level, which means you're often, spaces have been reduced to entire countries. You're trying to place influence there in a purely like either you're Soviet or you're US, and you're often trying to score those countries, like basically who has more influence. And I think that from the perspective of superpowers, that's probably accurate. But I think players should be very cautious of adopting that viewpoint themselves. In other words, if we don't have other mediums, whether those be books, documentaries, or games, to help us contextualize what is actually going on the ground, we'll actually view this as the Cold War itself, and we'll adopt the mindsets of superpowers, and we'll essentially get a very clean version of the Cold War. So what do I mean by that? Let's unpack a little bit what realignment roles and coup roles mean in Latin America. So these are the death counts of some of the countries that you're fighting over in Central America in Twilight Struggle. So Guatemala is not depicted in the Guerrilla Generation, but you're talking about 200,000 dead, mostly civilians in the Guatemalan Civil War, extensive use of scorched earth. They actually in the late 1970s were using sporadic massacres, and that wasn't really working. So they sat down in a big meeting and decided we're going to use systematic massacres, and then we're going to use civic action. So we're talking about really nasty stuff. And then in El Salvador, you also have the use of scorched earth and death squads. 70,000 died out of a population of only 4.5 million at the beginning of the war. So that's an incredible percentage, a couple percentage points of the entire population. And then you have, of course, the U.S. war-supported Contra movement in Nicaragua that's really waging intentional attacks against civilian infrastructure to try to undermine the Sandinista economy. And even though the Sandinistas were actually much more restrained than their U.S.-backed alternatives in the region, they did have a few nasty episodes where, for instance, they used forced relocation to move the Mosquito Indians from 10,000 Mosquito Indians from the Atlantic coast or the borders of Honduras. And so my point here is that when we're doing this influence struggle across this global scale, games like Twilight Struggle really rely on a handful of cards like this one, Latin American Death Squad, to try to add this context. And it's just not going to happen. And so I think that the Guerrilla Generation is going to try to help you understand what is going on the ground when you're taking these very abstract actions in Twilight Struggle, for instance.
And it's interesting that you're choosing Twilight Struggle as an example, because it feels like almost Jason Matthews also sees that as potentially maybe one flow of an amazing game that is Twilight Struggle, with this whole series of starting to make regional Twilight Struggle games where you really go more in depth. So the first one in the Horn of Africa, there is an upcoming one is in South Asia, and I think it does reflect a bit the same reflection that you're having here, right? Or like contextualizing a bit more, having more specific cards, better understanding regional dynamics. We're still not on a local level, but you're getting really closer to what those conflicts actually meant. You go one level deeper in terms of detail and a bit less abstraction. Do you feel like it's going in that same direction?
I think that it's getting better. So, like, for instance, we're getting, like you said, more specific cards. I do still wonder sometimes with the new series, which I think is the right move towards going towards that regional scale, whether it's just smaller Twilight Struggle, it's just like scoping Twilight Struggle to a less board space, or whether we're really doing a scale shift in terms of what we're modeling.
Yeah.
And like, because I don't necessarily, again, think that Twilight Struggle is necessarily flawed if you understand that it's the viewpoint of how superpowers think on the global scale. But I think I would have liked, they may prove me wrong with South Asia Monsoon, that if there was a little bit more attention to some of these issues. But I don't know I think that would require a different system at the regional level than kind of taking Twilight Struggle there. The other thing that I think that Cold War games don't necessarily, or I think better word, can't capture at the global scale is, particularly on the US side, that there are a lot of times during the Cold War where the idea that the president can do whatever they want in terms of foreign policy is actually challenged. And again, the games kind of give you a rational unitary actor model and then rely on a few events to hinder you. Whereas the big campaign scenario in the Guerrilla Generation is called Resisting Reagan. And it's where you're actually going to play as the Central American Peace Movement, which was a collection of American and Central American activists who are trying to stop Reagan's ability to wage his wars in Nicaragua and El Salvador. And I think that will highlight better these moments where you cannot, there's a much bigger debate in the United States about what we actually see as the United States' proper role in the world during the Cold War, and not just assume that, okay, the United States is in this struggle with the Soviet Union, we're going to fight this out, and we're not going to, and, flower power card is our only way of modeling those kind of dynamics. So this gets us to the last major broad theme of the Guerrilla Generation, which is, what does the Guerrilla Generation have to say about insurgency and counterinsurgency more broadly, not just in Latin America during the Cold War? And in terms of counterinsurgency, I think we've seen in a lot of the coin series games, at least, this heavy footprint coin. And what I mean by that is when the United States intervenes directly with hundreds of thousands of its own troops and tries to engage in state building, like, for instance, that we saw in Vietnam and Afghanistan. And that's really hard. And as we both know, it doesn't work out so well. And so at least it's, very difficult. And so there's often a temptation in the policy literature to say, why can't we just do light footprint coin? And this is sometimes even referred to as the Salvador option, because there's a view that this worked really well in El Salvador because the United States only had like 55 advisors and provided aid. And then the Salvadorian government was able to survive against the very strong FLN insurgency. And so in the Guerrilla Generation El Salvador, and also with really my expansion, Sovereign of Discord, it allows you to explore the difficulties of light footprint coin. That really there's all these other sorts of problems with doing light footprint coin as there is during heavy footprint coin. And one general theme of the talk today is that coin is always pretty hard. And so it's not going to be, you're going to just face a different set of challenges when you try to do this light version instead of the heavy version. In addition, what about the insurgent side? And I think that the Guerrilla Generation, as we talked about, is really about highlighting how insurgencies operate differently. And in the coin series, you've seen a lot of what I would call centralized rule insurgencies that are trying to take over territory and govern it and build up opposition, whether through agitation, Sharia, or terror mechanics. And as you can see, that's been in a lot of coin games. You have a fact that kind of is modeled that way. And then two of the insurgents, though I think they operate very differently in the game, in the Shining Path and FLN, are also going to follow that model. However, the Guerrilla Generation also offers two other models of how insurgencies operate. A cross-border insurgency, which is almost entirely dependent on external support, operating from foreign sanctuaries with very little internal support. And it's more of a raider faction. Like the closest thing in the coin series right now is actually Pendragon, getting this dynamics of these external raiders. And then, as we've already talked about, there's not a lot of urban insurgents who are entirely basically operating in major cities in the coin series, outside of arguably Cyprus and Palestine. That, if there's no questions, is...
Actually, I have a question, and I think it's probably going to be a transition of modeling coin without coin. If we look back at your previous slide, here you are talking about insurgency and counterinsurgency and their representation in different coin games.
Mhm.
But I'm thinking that there are quite a few coin adjacent games that are covering insurgency and counterinsurgency, that are covering some of the gaps that we have here. And I'm thinking specifically about urban insurgency and the series by Brian Train. That he released a few games with Hodenspiel. And I think the first one, what's the name of the series?
District Commander Maracas.
District Commander Maracas is actually looking specifically into the urban insurgency. What do you think about those other games or the system that are trying to depict this and fill in those blanks?
So I think that, as we're about to talk about, it's a great transition. That's at a very different scale, and it's trying to do much more about the specifics of how the processes of insurgency and counterinsurgency work, which, as somewhat counterintuitive, I'm about to argue in a second, that regardless of whether they're volumes or multi-packs, coin is actually not about counterinsurgency. And so we're going to talk about that potentially controversial claim here in a second, which gets us to modeling coin without coin. So to make this title sound fancy, I've used modeling coin without coin here, but the reason why there's an asterisk there is I'm really going to be talking about modeling interstate conflict. And by interstate conflict, I mean all the potential different types of conflicts you have within states. So that could be insurgencies or civil wars, which overlap, and potentially even coups. We can think about other forms. So just to give people kind of the broad so what question, this is from UCDP PRIO's data, but I just wanted to highlight why it is important that we talk about interstate conflict. And the reason why is that since the Cold War, it is without question have been the majority of conflicts, because the light blue here is represented by the number of intrastate conflicts. The tan is actually internationalized intrastate conflicts. And even the dark blue is what we call extrastate conflicts, which you can often think of as the colonial wars, which most people would actually include under intrastate conflicts, like colonial twilight. And so then that orange line, or that dark yellow, that's very, very small, is actually interstate conflicts. And so as we saw with Ukraine, obviously, it's very important to study interstate conflict, even though they're fairly rare because of how costly, and damaging they are. But I think that this is worth remembering as we go through this rest of this talk. And before someone says, why don't I model again Cold War gone hot, 1985, is that maybe we actually model the conflicts that did happen in 1985 and not the hypothetical conflict with the Soviet Union over and over and over again. Now, some grognards, though, might be getting a little nervous that I don't know if I want to stick around for this talk about interstate conflicts. So I just want to remind everybody that there are conventional interstate wars. You don't have to, necessarily care about insurgencies to care about interstate conflicts. Three of the biggest topics in wargaming are the American Civil War, the Spanish Civil War, and the English Civil War. And there's a lot of games on these topics. I mean, somebody has even made a trick-taking English Civil War game. I mean,
crazy.
Yeah. It's clearly getting a lot of coverage. And so even though I'm going to be talking about modeling coin without coin, I'm really talking about even these conventional interstate conflicts that often coin is maybe not so good at modeling. All right. So how am I going to approach this part of the talk? Well, I think it's really important to basically identify what does coin do well, and then what are all the things it doesn't do well. In other words, what are the things that are kind of outside of what coin can show you versus what it can do. And so I tried to sit down and really identify precisely what does coin, in my opinion, do well. And I would argue it does a good job at showing an overview of the conduct of a conflict between major factions at the strategic scale. And again, I'm talking here both about multi-packs and volumes. I think that the issues we're about to talk about transcends that kind of philosophical debate between those two models. And so I'm going to use each part of that definition to talk about what coin struggles with. And so just to give kind of a clarifying definition of what each of those are, you should think, I think the strategic scale is pretty familiar with a lot of war gamers because we have tactical, operational, strategic, but to think of it really quickly, think of the map in the coin series as pretty much always covering the entire country. So we're kind of out of a whole country or a whole conflict level. In terms of factions, I think the factions is actually the perfect word for what the actors you play in coin are, which is kind of these political coalitions that sometimes are aggregating a lot of groups together. And then finally, what do we mean by conduct? Conduct is a stage of war. It doesn't show you how it begins. It doesn't show you how it ends. It shows you how it's fought. And I would think in terms of coin mainly as the faction menus. So let's start with scale. So what is the limitations of adopting the strategic scale? And I chose the beigest of the beige maps, which is very brown, a distant plane here. And so when you play a distant plane, you would get the idea that these wars are often really strategized and fought at the strategic whole country level. And you'd be wrong. So one thing that we're going to talk about is that often coin suffers from this problem where it is either too abstract. If we really want to understand insurgency and counterinsurgency processes, the scale of coin is too high. We're going to have to go lower. And I'm going to give you some examples of that. On the other hand, if you actually want to understand the broad political processes that actually decide how these conflicts end or how they're actually decided, coin is actually way too low of scale because it's not actually looking at broad political things that matter. And I'm going to give you
yeah, it's interesting that you have this thing about it has two issues and they are conflicting. It's at the same time too abstract and not abstract enough, because it reminds me of the conversations that we had about Ici c'est la France.
Oh, believe me, Ici c'est la France is coming up.
Yeah, okay, good, because it really, like, all the discussion that we had around this for me illustrated it even more than the coin series. This inability to find the right scale to show something that is effective enough to better understand the conflict itself. But yeah, I'll let you continue then. If it's coming, that's fine.
Yes. So to give you a teaser of what kind of Fred's alluding to is that I'm going to essentially argue here that often we're going to need two models rather than just one for depicting conflict, and that if we had lower scale models and higher scale models, we'd actually learn more than if we just had this kind of general overview, kind of strategic level scale. All right, so let's go back to our good old beige Afghanistan. And again, as I was saying, if you really, this will give you the idea that everything is fought at the national level. And you'd be 100% wrong, because actually in almost every single counterinsurgency campaign, there are regional commands. So for instance, this is NATO's regional commands, and they actually split the Southern Command, the yellow, into two later in the war, that each part was taken by a different part of NATO. And this is true of a whole bunch of other conflicts. So this is actually a comparison of regional commands by the US, which would be the core zones and Orban, versus the NLF had their own military regions. And then this is actually a map of Algeria, the French military regions in Algeria. And so why do countries do this? Why do they delegate like this? It's because in actuality, there's huge variation in terms of geography, the demographics, strategic kind of either roads or capital or resources, and also the proximity to international borders. And the nature of these conflicts are just completely different often across these regional commands. And so you want a command structure that can actually capture, for instance, the Taliban's border areas where there's most of the activity occurred in the war in Afghanistan, versus the north, which might be much more quiet but have to do with kind of warlord politics.
Yeah.
And you'll get like impressions of that while playing something like ADP or Fire in the Lake. But often there's a question of, if it's really at the regional level, why aren't the games at the regional level? So give an example of that. This is the 4th core zone of the Mekong Delta in Fire in the Lake. It is 5 spaces. So 4 provinces and a city. And you get some lines of communication tossed in there. And this is a map of the districts of 4th Corps Vietnam if we looked at it from the regional level, in terms of we get much more granularity. And what I'm going to argue in the next few slides is that if you really want to understand the processes of how counterinsurgency and insurgency actually work, coin simply doesn't do that. It's about showing, it's going to give you an impressionistic picture that help you either, as we talked about, understand interfaction dynamics in the main volumes, or get this broad canvas of like quick intros in the multi-packs. So let's talk about some examples of this. Everybody knows support and opposition, right? It's like, how do we measuring the attitudes of the population in the coin series? And this is what it would look like for this portion of the Mekong Delta in Fire in the Lake. This is a little bit closer to what the real life complexity would be. This is a map of the Hamlet evaluation system during the Vietnam War, where the US was essentially coding all the villages that it could. And all that red you see are red Vs for Viet Cong controlled. All the green are Ds and Es, which are like contested. And then the black are A, B, and Cs, which are like government contested but favoring the government. And what we see is a lot more granularity and complexity about what is going on in the war. And it's much harder, in other words, to shift. And we have this leopard spot pattern. Whereas in coin, we have this massive aggregation of what is going on here. And so I think that a lot of players have complained about coin, like, look at how easy it is to shift the political attitudes of the population, for instance. And the answer is because of that level of aggregation. And that I don't think people can really appreciate the complexities of that at the scale that coin depicts. Now you might go, what about control? So this is, I tried to show pictures of Fujian, the controlled Fujian province, but I then was reminded that Fujian province does not exist in Fire and Lake. You get a combination of Fuban and Fujian. And so this is what Fujian would look like in the a 1966 control map of Fujian in real life versus in the game. So in the game, you just do a comparison of wooden pieces, and there's no actual way of conveying what are the areas of the provinces, for instance, that the Viet Cong control versus the US controls or the ARVN controls. And so you might be asking, okay, you got to abstract in every game, so why is that important? So on the left, again, we have our good old control map of Fujian province. On the right, you have the population density of Fujian province. And what you see is that the Viet Cong basically controlled the sparsely populated highlands, and the US control and the ARVN controlled the much more population dense coastal fertile area. And actually, if you read about it, the dynamics of counterinsurgency in Fujian province was largely driven by that geographic difference. Is that the Viet Cong and NVA main forces would be operating in the sparsely populated areas they controlled, and they would have to rely on the pacification struggle over the rice in those fertile areas, so that way they had enough food. And so they had to threaten those areas enough to draw the US into the highlands, so that way the Viet Cong could actually operate in the rice fertile areas to actually get enough food to keep those main forces alive. And so none of those dynamics are covered by Fire and Lake. And that's just a scale problem. It just simply cannot depict that. Even worse, so here, again, on the left, we've got our control map of Fujian. So on the right, this map is showing areas of Fujian that had a 30 to 60% population reduction from refugee generation. So during the Vietnam War, refugee generation, I would argue, is one of the most fundamental social processes, not only for understanding the human scale of the conflict and the human cost of the conflict, but also for both the US and ARVN and the NLF's strategies. Whenever the United States would essentially penetrate, as you can see, there's a very strong correlation here between insurgent controlled areas and where there's these massive population reductions. And I should explain here, the black is Viet Cong controlled, the dashed is contested, and the white is government controlled. And so what the US would often do is generate refugees to undermine the liberated areas of the NLF. And if you read NLF documents and interviews, they were really worried about this. It's one of the things they were actually worried about the most. And so there are, however, no refugees in Vietnam war games. There's there's many strategic level Vietnam war games. And despite the fact that millions of people were made refugees, and it was one of the most important ways the United States actually gained any sort of pacification progress during the war, it's simply not included. Now, you might be wondering there, Fred, how are there images of cards that look like Fire in the Lake about refugees? And the answer is I had to design a whole prequel expansion just to get some gosh darn refugee cards in the Fire in the Lake. And those cards are not really sufficient, though. The point here is that if we really want to understand some of these dynamics I've been giving you examples of, you just got to go lower than what the coin series can give. This impressionistic view of how insurgency and counterinsurgency work just is not going to be good enough to capture some of, I think, these very important aspects, such as the human cost of refugee generation. Now, luckily, we have started seeing some games that are trying to go to those lower levels and I think capture some aspects of this, even if they don't necessarily capture refugee generation. If we think of ADP as the strategic level, we now have, as we were talking about earlier, Brian Train's District Commander series at more of a province level or department level. And then actually Zermatt, which is tactical and is actually focusing on one district within a province in Afghanistan. And it's really about kind of gauging much more of the complexities of this, who's on your side and who's not. Even though that I should note that to give you an idea is that these are actually villages, and you actually would go lower to the hamlet level in Vietnam, which would be more analogous to that what you would see in a movie like Platoon, or what they're walking into. That's a hamlet, whereas you can think of villages here really as townships. And that's closer to what you're getting to with Zermatt. And so I think that these are good first stabs at doing lower level counterinsurgency processes, but I think we still need more to flesh out these lower scale dynamics.
the whole time when we were talking about seeing more of the complexity and all this, it reminds me of a game that you showed me, and I started to play on my paper ink tablet called Viva Fidel. This solo game where you have all those small dots and you are actually assigning some of the action points that you have to build your insurgency. Do you think that there were in the past already games like Viva Fidel that were trying to do this in interesting ways that we should look back to and maybe get inspired by?
I generally think that we should look back more often to games, because there's a lot of games in the past that I think people are fully right are completely unplayable now. Like they're way too long, they're maybe too complex, they're too fiddly. But that doesn't mean as designers we shouldn't look back and that there's not a lot of really smart, at least attempts at doing so. I think the only danger of doing so, as we'll talk about at the very end of the talk, is that there was just far less data to work off of back when someone like that was designing, and that the political science literature on civil wars and insurgency really exploded in the early 2000s. And I would say the empirical literature in, for instance, history or anthropology or some of those other literatures is also really exploded and is of a much better quality than what existed back then. So I think that there's often a lot of really good ideas, or I should say creative ideas, and that one really needs to check that against what we know now, to make sure that you're not kind of adopting a mechanic. But Viva Fidel, I think, is going to do a really good job when we get to the stage portion of the talk, at depicting something that I don't think is covered at all now in the present. All right, so that was the too abstract. But what about the non-abstract enough? Which I think is actually the more counterintuitive one, which is that I'm going to tell you that we need to actually do more abstract depictions of counterinsurgency to actually learn anything from the level that you get in the coin series. So this is where our good old friend ECC La France shows up. Now, one big critique of the counterinsurgency field manual, U.S. counterinsurgency field manual, is that it's been accused of being a strategy of tactics, that it is a operational doctrine, and that it can't actually solve for you, for instance, big strategic or political processes. In other words, we can't just go to Afghanistan with the operational FM 324 manual and solve the problem, because there are things that simply are beyond the operational level. And a good example of that is that it's kind of often argued that the FLN insurgency in Algeria won politically but lost militarily, and that they were in really rough shape inside Algeria on the ground at the end of the war, but had done enough in areas outside of Algeria, the French home front, international scene, and getting external support, that they were able to essentially force France to negotiate. And I think that games like Colonial Twilight and EC La France recognize this. But what they do is that they take those much broader political processes and they turn them into a 5 to 6 point track. And so all of that external complexity is being reduced to a track that tries to cover that. Whereas the vast majority of the complexity of the game is devoted to the map in Algeria and the dynamics of insurgency and counterinsurgency going on the map. The problem is that one could argue that what is being depicted in that track is as important, if not more important, what is going on the map. In other words, if we really want to understand how conflicts are determined, the map might just be one battleground. If we think of a CDG, broader political struggle, and we need to flesh out what are being represented by these tracks. And the unfortunate thing is that Coin does this all the time. It's just, and I've even included the Hugna track because, as we talked about earlier, I've done this too. And it's often very nice if you're trying to provide a general overview of conflict to include these tracks. I'm very happy they do include them. But I think it's worth recognizing that these tracks in themselves are important things to gain, and that they're often going to be, as we said, just as important, if not more important, than all these little details on the map. And now, a very minor and insufficient solution to this is actually the campaign modes and multipacks. I'm trying to add those really to provide more transnational and international context about these broader processes. But I actually don't think that that's really enough, because I'm not going to entertain here that the end of Empire came as like a whole game on decolonization. It's really just a way of providing a little bit more broader context. And so I think that we're really left with a situation where we might wonder, is there a scale that really is lower than Labyrinth or lower than Twilight Struggle, but higher than something like ADP, where we can capture some of the maybe diplomacy or broader political processes that would actually determine something like, for instance, the U.S. negotiating with Pakistan, which is simply going to have a massive impact on the war in Afghanistan. Yeah. And then we reduce what we see in the level of complexity we see in the distant plain to just a few spaces, or much more generic kind of even insurgency or counterinsurgency model, so we can capture that greater focus on broader political processes. So I promise that the actors and stage parts of the talk are much shorter than scale, because I think scale is actually really important for capturing that kind of too abstract or not abstract enough point. Any questions about scale or?
No, I think it's an interesting thought, and it makes me reflect on a lot of things. But I think that's going to be useful more in an offline discussion between the two of us. I don't think it's necessary here, but I think you make a really strong point here.
All right, so moving on to the second one is that what we're going to talk about now is the limitation of factions. And so I've got a picture here of the FARC, as one of the major factions in Andean Abyss. And some of the factions in coin games are tied to pretty concrete organizations. So, for instance, the FARC insurgency or the government of Colombia. But I think it's worth recognizing that almost with any coin faction, there's a heavy degree of aggregation going on. Whereas the FARC is really the FARC and the ELN and a whole bunch of other even smaller leftist groups. And the Colombian government is the civilian decision makers, the police, and the military. Whereas actually in counterinsurgency, we'd often talk about a unity of effort problem where you have to actually coordinate across those three. In addition, and then on top of that, you've got things like the AUC, which includes all of the potential paramilitary groups, including the kind of centrally organized AUC one. And then probably often the most extreme level of aggregation is often happening with the green factions or the economically motivated factions. Like at that time, the cartels were not unified. The syndicate is not unified in Cuba Libre, the warlords in Afghanistan, so on and so forth. So we're really aggregating the player role into these kind of broad political coalitions that is argued to have kind of a unified interest or stake in the conflict. So then I'm just going to briefly talk about a couple of different types of other actors that I think coin ignores. And the first one is that coin ignores often within faction differences. And so this, for instance, shows you the complexity of the NLF at just the provincial level, and that they have all of these different subdivisions to try to actually get their organization or system to actually work at for instance, the province level. And so as I just mentioned a second ago, unity of effort is just so important to the counterinsurgency literature about how you do well in terms of getting the civilians and the military to actually coordinate military operations and civic action, that I really think that there should be more depiction of these kind of within faction differences. But again, as we talked about with spreading agency out, particularly in a multi-faction framework, that's going to be very hard to do. I don't think it's ever going to be legible to actually have multiple factions, but then also have within faction splits. Other actors neglected by the coin series. So the coin series really neglects civilians. They're often just a space on the board that you're fighting for. And again, this is true of the ones that I have done, and I actually talk about this in my British Way design notes. And otherwise, civilians show up in kind of cards. But everyday civilians are, in terms of depicted as in something like this War of Mine, I think is a really neglected area in game design in general. And I do think that I think this War of Mine is a good first stab. And I think that there are some very interesting critiques of this War of Mine, which I actually also agree with. That, for instance, it's like it's like a zombie apocalypse version of what something looks like, which might be true in some settings, but not really true in many of the ones at least I've studied. And then another major type of actor would be local actors. So this idea that counterinsurgency is always local, if we actually do what I'm saying and take the scale down, we're going to have to start dealing with things like local power brokers or local elites that might have their own interests that might be not part of these macro cleavages between the two sides. And something like Pax Premier, I think, does a really good job of that. But again, I have squabbles with various things about that one too. Finally, I think it's worth entertaining the idea that coin often depicts populations as holistic. It's like a one single population number outside of maybe something like ADP, and it doesn't show groups within populations. However, one thing I really want to stress here is that a lot of games have tried to show these differences among different classes or groups. In terms of making those players, like for instance, Hegemony recently did, I think you need to be really careful about that, because we, for instance, have really moved away from that in political science over the last 20 years, because groupism is a real problem where it's okay to have people play as an ethnic politician or an ethnic party or an ethnic insurgent group. It's different than to say, I'm playing as the Kurds or I'm playing as the Serbs, and essentially making someone into attributing interests and actions to an entire group of people as a whole is probably a very dangerous game of extraction that I don't think designers should necessarily do, or should at least be very cautious before they do it. All right, so finally, let's talk about the limitations of what I call conduct, or the stage of conduct. You can see here a map of Malaya, my Malaya game all set up, and we see that we're well within the war in terms of fighting the insurgency. But then that raises some questions, though, about like all of our games just show us how to fight wars, but that's leaving out 2/3 of the problem, really. And so, what do we mean by stages? So, in the Civil Wars literature, you can think of 3 stages of civil wars. There's Civil War onset, which is how do civil wars begin. There's Civil War conduct, which are how are they fought, which is what almost every single game in existence is on. And then there's Civil War termination. How are civil wars ended? And I'm going to argue that each often require different actors, scales, and dynamics to explain. In other words, we need different game systems for each one of these. And so someone might say, oh, in All Bridges Burning, there's this like pre-war phase. That's not good enough. That's like just an appendage of a conduct model, in my opinion. We need an entire model to show us the dynamics at the beginning and the end, because some actors, and I think one critique of All Bridges might be that the moderates factions makes a lot of sense at the beginning, but as you move into the war itself, that gets a little bit sketchier about whether they actually had enough agency during the war to affect things.
Yeah, so I'm trying to, and maybe it's the conclusion that you're going to come to, but I'm trying to reconcile all of those criticism that you have from the core system and how to resolve those, because in a way, I think all of those are very legitimate, and I think the stages of civil war is really interesting. The fact that we focus on the conduct and not on the onset or determination. It's the same for regular warfare. Like war games have always been focused on war conduct. And it's only really recently that we started having games about the onset of war. So I think a good example of that is Fort Sumter, thinking about the beginning of war and then the end of war. So I think Versailles, if we stay into the Mark Herman extended universe, is a good example of that. But that's also that's something that the whole hobby, I would say, suffers from, and that we only see new things. And when I'm looking at this and I'm reconciling it all together, I see what the value of a multipack could be, but I'm almost feeling like the thing that you're suggesting or going towards, and it's interesting that you would go in that direction, because it's something that I've been playing in my mind with, but I think is maybe a bit insane, is that to properly represent at least a civil war, you should have a multipack that would contain maybe 12 mini games at different scales, at different level, informing each other, and showing maybe what's happening with local actors. And at the same time, like if we take the example of I think the war in Algeria, which is one that I've been reading a lot about, you'd have something on the diplomatic level, something specifically on the borders, and the whole conflicts that you have between transborder conflict, and the fact that the LN is trying to have bases outside and moving in. You have the whole game around internal politics for the insurgent movement, and the tension that there is, first between competing movements, but then within the movement, the FLN itself. You've got it could have games specifically on La Bataille d'Alger and insurgency guerrilla. You could have something that is a bit more on a strategic level, and the different levels of commandment and how you assign different resources. And I'm thinking, is this really feasible to say, well, like I want to do a proper job at depicting the Algerian civil war, and for this to work, I need to have something like this, and the game will end with the Evian Accord game that would be a civil war termination game, where every small game that you played before are actually a resolution of that and inform that final stage. I'm thinking, is this possible? That's the thing that I'm thinking. And I think it's good that we're looking at it critically. I think it makes sense, but can we really use all of that? That's the thing that I'm just wondering about. And it can be yes.
Yeah. So I would say yes, but what do we mean by yes? Yeah. So can you put this all into one game? No. Can you even put this all into one box as like a multi-pack? No. And what I think we should think about this as is that any good model is going to be good at one very narrow thing. So when I'm critiquing Coin here, remember we started this carefully as what is Coin good at? Yeah. And then we said, what are all the things that it's not good at? And so what we need here is what we often do in the social sciences, I would argue, is a mini model approach. Yeah. We need models, a number of series that cover all different scales, different actors, different stages. So that way, and we don't even need them really to connect. We just need them to so that we understand the full array of what's going on in interstate conflicts. Because I think the danger here is that people, and what I'm trying to really highlight with this talk is that you think that coin is the final word. Is that like coin is how we understand interstate conflict. And I'm jumping to the conclusion a little bit, but the answer here is that coin tells you remarkably little. What it does tell you, it does pretty well, but we need a mini model approach. And my response to you about whether this is feasible is, haven't we been doing this with the American Civil War? Yeah. Like, we've got a million P ridges, and we've got a whole podcast now that's going to walk us through all these different things. And we've got a couple games, luckily, now on the slavery. We've got a couple games in the lead up to the war. We've got a game now on Fort Sumter, and unfortunately, we don't have any games yet on Reconstruction, but I think that we have some coming.
It's going to come, yeah.
And so with any topic, I think it's important to recognize that wargaming has been, even on ones that we feel like we've covered a whole bunch, like World War II or the American Civil War, they've been incredibly narrow about what they're delivering. And my point here is really for interstate conflict, we need to, or I would argue for really any topic in wargaming or gaming in general, we need to break that narrowness and fully comprehend what we're missing before we're ever going to be able to improve ourselves.
Yeah. Okay. But then I get more where you're aiming at, and I think that makes a lot more sense to me. And I think it's good that you're taking the example of the American Civil War, because it is one of the period of history, like the most game in the hobby, if you exclude World War II. And it's interesting how, I agree, narrow the depiction has been purely on kinetic aspect. It is honestly baffling that this is the case after. So I think Gettysburg by Avalon Hill was in the mid-60s, something like this, and you have a 60 year of doing pretty much the same thing in different ways with different aesthetics and everything. And I'm like, well, war is not just that, and I think it's interesting. So that's what you're advocating for, and that makes a lot of sense. Good. Yeah, just wanted to clarify this.
It's a great clarification, because what I'm not saying here is that like I'm a madman who's going to make a 12-game multi-pack where in one box you're going to get to see all these different angles. Like, obviously that would be ideal, but I think that would be, like you said, impossible. And I don't think that we should put that responsibility on a single designer.
Yeah.
And so hopefully we'll have designers trying to answer some of these gaps. So really this is all about identifying gaps where I think games could help us understand things better. So what do we mean by coin neglects onset? So the question here is that this is what Cuba Libre looks like at the start of the game. And this is related to your question about that Viva Fidel game.
Yeah.
That is a lot going on. They've got a base, 2 guerrillas, they've got all the population on their side, and they control the whole Sierra Maestra. But if you remember what happens in December 1956 when Castro lands, is they get immediately ambushed, and they're down to like 18 barely armed men. And so what we're advocating for, based off this clarification we just talked about, is we need a game that explains how you go from 18 barely armed men to this. And like the coin can just never do that. That's just not what coin's about. And so we need an entirely different system that explains how insurgencies begin. And of course, you mentioned Fort Sumter, but I'm going to mention the good one, is that this is a gross oversimplification, but you can think of 2 pathways of how insurgencies or civil wars begin. There's a mass mobilization pathway that's predominantly in urban centers, where you have a social movement that in the face of repression basically rises up, and you have this often a large explosion of violence, whether that being as part of the rebellion or as the crushing of the rebellion, like we saw with the Paris Commune. And alternatively, you have clandestine mobilization on the rural periphery, which is all on the very reaches of the country. And often the violence is very small scale. And it's, at least I have a paper that's under review right now, often very indistinguishable from banditry.
Yeah.
So it's launching the same kind of small scale attacks as banditry. And there's basically no game on that. The only one I could find is that like Freedom in the Galaxy at the beginning has like this kind of idea that you're a small group of personalities that are going around trying to organize rebellion as like a very small group. I think that is closer to the 18 barely armed guys men and women going around trying to get to this point that you see at the beginning of Cuba Libre. And so this, for instance, is a huge gap. I would love it if game designers try to fill that gap, and I'm at least trying to do that for the clandestine mobilization route. But I think Red Flag and Freedom in the Galaxy are good examples of that. It gives us the coin neglects termination. So as anybody who's played the coin series knows, how the games end is that, at least in the main volumes, you have this plus this. Or for instance, for the US, you have support, how much does the people like the government, plus how many of my troops are unavailable. And then you get over a certain threshold, and then if you're high enough, you win. And if you're higher than other people, you win more. And when you win, you go read a little narrative paragraph in the back of the booklet. In other words, I don't think it's unreasonable to suggest that coin completely punts on endings. Like, it doesn't really model how things end at all. And I think that this has created a lot of the tension and frustration that some people have with volumes like Vietnam and Afghanistan, because they see what happened at the end. And then they look at at least in the base game, Fire and Lake or ADP, how the US won, and they say, okay, Brian and Volko, or Volko and Mark, yes, at a certain stage, the US was doing pretty well, and then everything fell apart. So what does that victory even mean then? And then Volko and Mark, or Volko and Brian, would say, well, at that stage, based off of how we've defined it, they did well. And I think that that is correct. And so it's just, but the truth of the matter is they're both right, which is that coin just doesn't try to model those final endings. And to be perfectly frank, as someone who was a developer and playtester in the game, I think one of the reasons why Fall of Saigon was a complete nightmare to design and develop is because it was trying to give a concrete ending to a series that does not do concrete endings, which just made it very hard to actually figure that out. But generally speaking, coin just does not provide concrete endings. In the multi-packs, I do things a little bit differently, and I try to provide a little bit easier to interpret, but I will fully admit still vague ending, which is that I use political will and translate players' actions through government political will. And what you can think of this as a bargaining model of civil war, is that if the game ends in the middle, you're at some sort of negotiated settlement that either favors one side or the other. In other words, the rebels have able to extract concessions from the government, but they might not have been able to fully topple them. Whereas at the extremes, you either have a marginalized insurgency that just dies off in the jungle, like happened in Malaya, or you have a overthrow of, for instance, Castro's victory over Batista.
Yeah.
And I think that you can interpret political will a little differently across the different games, but that's a broad sense what this is trying to, how you would read the end board state. But again, I think that this is not really fully capturing what I'm talking about in terms of the gap of modeling termination. And as you already alluded to, Versailles jumped ahead of me on everything. So is that I would love to show you some examples of games modeling in the commercial hobby, at least, the termination of civil wars, but they simply do not exist, at least as far as I could tell. We do not have games on the politics of negotiated settlements and spoilers, which is a real thing. It's a huge part of the academic literature. We don't have games on truth and reconciliation commissions, which are a very important part of how civil wars end and also have a lot of politics involved. But as you already noted, we don't have a list for interstate war, and that's what people like. So, this is a huge gap just in general in wargaming. Concluding on all this, let's remember that coin does this well. It does an overview of the conduct of a conflict between major factions at the strategic scale. What I've just shown you is all the things it doesn't do. And any good model, like we've said earlier, is not going to do a lot of things because it's scoped to doing the things that it's defined to do. And so this is not to say that coin is bad or that you need to throw away and burn all your coin games, but it's to have you recognize what are the big gaps for designers, and also as players, what is left for me to understand. Again, coin provides a good general overview, but it doesn't, as we've talked about, cover lower and higher scale processes of conflict because of the scale that it chose. There's all of these actors outside of major factions that it often does just simply aggregates out that do exist, and it doesn't cover beginnings and endings. And so that raises the question that at the beginning of this talk, I try to sell you a coin game. So then there's a question of, if you, Stephen, recognize all the problems, why on earth are you still designing coin games? It seems like the dumbest man in the world. And so the answer to that is that there's a lot of reasons to still design a coin game. And one is particularly in these obscure, neglected aspects of the hobby, if there's no game on a topic, like no game on, women's right to votes, or no game on this emergency in Cyprus, or that we are now finally seeing games on, it makes sense that the first one would be a general overview.
Yeah.
Often, just like it makes sense that the first history book on something, we have to first kind of get the facts, right? What happened before we're going to try to model very more focused dynamics. In addition, there's a lot of topics that I think that there's just insufficient data on. I don't think that all the topics in the multi-packs that I cover, there's really enough data on to do lower scale games, for instance. Like you need a lot of data to depict those things. And so the concern would be that if we really only focus on doing really heavy games on really focused data, we're going to create the same narrowest problem in terms of topics that we had in wargaming, interstate wargaming or conventional wargaming. And that, like, it makes sense that people want to study World War II and the Civil War in some sense, the kinetic side, because there's a long military history. There's a ton of data. You can go to the National Archives and look up the order of battle. And what I would argue is you can do that for a lot of topics like Vietnam and French War in Algeria, especially if you're French, and you have access to those archives, and so on and so forth. But there's a lot of topics that we just can't do that for, or that just does not exist. But we might still want games on them. And then finally, I think often in historical board gaming, you don't see designs that go beyond the general overview because understandably as a hobby, the designer basically reads some general history books and then designs a game that models that, which I think is very useful as an intro. But I don't think history is often going to be able to give you a sufficient understanding to do model detailed processes, particularly if you don't have the legacy of, like, kinetic warfare in gaming has decades of modeling to essentially read like a literature. Whereas if you're trying to do social movements, for instance, or some of these other, or how insurgencies begin, it's zero, or it's a handful of games that came out in the last 5 years. And so I would recommend that you go look at the sociology or political science to try to help you design those detailed processes, rather than trying to read them from a historical narrative, which is what you'll often get from history that might be hard to actually extract that out. And so what are the concluding takeaways here is that I think adding additional coin designs are going to be useful for expanding the number of conflicts that have been modeled, but not much more. Like, we've already have a lot of games showing the interfaction dynamics. We already have now, with every multi-pack, I create 4 more games for you to explore. But like, that's going to give us more topics, but it's not going to get at these detailed processes. In addition, as we've already talked about, a large portion of the more obscure non-coin system counterinsurgency games outside of the series suffer from all these issues that I've talked about, and that they all, like, their ECC La France, I think, suffers from almost every single thing that we've talked about in relation to coin. And I think that one thing that I would recommend for people who want to try to explore these gaps that I've talked about is that I think we need to stop relying so much, which I detect all the time in a lot of counterinsurgency designs, on what I call the practitioner literature on insurgency and counterinsurgency. And so this is where I'm going to conclude.
So what do you mean by practitioner literature?
Here we go. So what do I mean by practitioner literature? I mean manuals. I mean core text by practitioners like David Galula or Mao or Che, or by people like David Kilcullen would be a more up-to-date one. So in other words, like, kind of participant views of best practices, or the manuals themselves. The problem is that those are often what the actors wanted to happen, or what they wish would happen. What they wanted to happen, or what they thought happened. And the problem is that we now have, over the last 20 years, 2 just phenomenally literatures of both empirically and analytically that you can draw from now. One is the political science civil wars literature, which has just completely exploded. And one of the advantages it has here is that, I don't think we always get it right, but as political scientists, what we're really trying to do is what happened and explaining what happened versus what we wanted to happen and what we thought happened, and doing that really kind of vaguely and often uncritically. In addition, like history, the stuff that has recently come out in history over the last 20 years is just phenomenal. And one thing that it's very analytical. We often have new archives that have been opened. We often have, importantly, archives on both sides, which I can't stress that enough. Many of those practitioner literatures are inferring how they won from just viewing one side's perspective, which is always going to be dangerous. Whereas now we have archives, for instance, on both sides. Like Chris Gosha had access to the Vietnamese archives. He had access to the French archives when he was writing Road to Dien Bien Phu. And we can see how those 2 systems interacted much better. And I am still shocked today how frequently I see people talking about the Vietnam War as if they're going off the literature of the 1980s, or if they're going off the literature of the very narrow military side of things. Whereas the war, I should tell everyone here that is interested in Vietnam, the empirical literature on the Vietnam War has continued to grow very rapidly and is as best as it's ever been. And I think that a lot of previous findings about Vietnam have been pretty seriously overturned because of more analytical work and because those archives have been opened. And I think that we need to base more of our games off of these things than reusing, like, the very vague things that Mao say, or the things that Che say, said that which didn't even explain how he won in Cuba. And so what I want to conclude you with is a quote from Chris Gosha from his new book on Indochina, which I think encapsulates how I feel about the coin series, which is that Chris Gosha identifies that there are all these veterans of the French War in Indochina, which labeled themselves as counterinsurgency specialists who studied Indochina and maybe some other conflicts, and went off on their little way to Algeria, thinking that they really understood, for instance, how the Viet Minh beat them. And what Chris Gosha concludes at the end of his book is that they, in his view, understood remarkably little about how the Viet Minh actually beat them and about how revolutionary warfare actually works. And what I am warning here is that I think that we should try to do more of what Chris Gosha has done, which is look at both the French and the Vietnamese side. So that way we avoid the problem of marching off with our little coin system, very narrow coin system, thinking that we have essentially figured everything out. Whereas we should recognize that the coin system, as I said earlier, really tells us remarkably little in the grand scheme of things about interstate conflict. And that we should recognize that it's narrow, and that we should recognize these gaps. And I think that we should try to cover more of these gaps. And that's what I'll be doing, in addition to churning out multipacks, because I want people to understand more of that complexity so that they don't have these simple minds in their model, just like maybe Galula or Raj did when they went to Algeria. And so that's where I'll end things today, is that coin is the intro or at the beginning, not the final word on counterinsurgency.
That's a very compelling, strong argument. Maybe to conclude this, because people like lists, if you think about what you all said and you look about all those gaps and the limits of the coin series, and not necessarily drawing upon the thing that you're working on specifically, but what are the games looking in the next 5 to 10 years that you kind of hope would be released? Looking at the beginning of insurgency warfare, at the conclusion of civil wars, what are the things that you would like to see?
So one thing that I am working on right now that I would like to see, and I would also be very interested in seeing other people's take on it, is that I would love to see those regional commands really be modeled.
Yeah.
Because to me, coin is as we talked about, too abstract. And district commander, which is kind of the only other alternative we might be talking about right now, is on a much lower scale where there's often less strategic decisions. So we want the more granularity than what coin series gives us, but we want more strategic choices than what district commander gives us. And I think that is really an important level of conflict that is just not being modeled. And again, I would like to see someone try to answer the question of, for instance, why did the U.S. do so poorly in Vietnam or Afghanistan, that focuses less on what happened in the country, but about all the other things the White House, for instance, had to worry about. So like, there's I don't think the home front is modeled particularly well in a lot of Vietnam games. I don't think that the broader Indochina problems in terms of how do you cut off supplies from North Vietnam, how do you worry about Laos and Cambodia, they're often all afterthoughts to giving you tons of detail on what's going on inside the country. So I would like to see that. And then I think I would really like to see more people, almost from an ethical point of view, think about how conflicts end and begin.
Yeah.
Because I think a lot of people in war, I think it's perfectly reasonable. I think it's very important, and I do this actually in my academic work, to think about conduct. I think conduct really matters. It matters why some groups use more violence against civilians than others. I think it matters for determining outcomes. But I think if we really want to be serious about understanding war, I think it's a little suspicious to me that we don't care about beginnings and endings. Because really, if we care about peace more than war, beginnings and endings are as important, if not more important, than conduct. And so trying to show why the insurgencies begin, I think would be really helpful for people in terms of understanding the news. And I also think that there's often a wonder, like, why can't the UN just step in and get everybody get along? And so a game of modeling about peace negotiations would be, I really like that, would appreciate that too. And then let me just conclude with that. I think that there's too much reliance on this war of mine to like cover the civilian perspective. And that everyone, like I did in my talk, says, oh, there's this war of mine, and that covers the civilian perspective. But that's not what I'm going to do today. I'm going to talk about all these other things. And that I think that it would require a very kind of careful approach that read a ton of civilian memoirs, and that read, I actually have interviews, for instance, with civilians from the Vietnam War that were taken by the United States, but we luckily have. and really looking at what were kind of the dynamics and choices they had, and like realizing the limitations of what you can do with a board game, and thinking hard about things like care and things like that. Because I think that would be much more informative than a kind of like Purple Haze narrative game that depicts like Platoon, movie Platoon, more than what was actually going on for everyday people in Vietnam. But that's just me. So maybe, people might be really excited about Purple Haze, and that's fine. But that's
no, of course, it's not. The matter is not about saying that what exists is necessarily bad, or that what people enjoy is wrong. It's just I think you're just making a really compelling point about the things that we depict, that we choose to depict, and the fact that there are so many other things that we could look into. And I think that's a very, I must say, I will repeat it again, it's a very compelling argument. And even for me myself, because you were talking about inspiring other designers, I design games too, and I know that just that even if we had some discussions before about those topics, I must say the fact that you put together everything right now actually made for me a more compelling point about your main arguments. Like seeing all of it together makes a lot more sense for me right now. I understand more of some other discussion that we've had on the side where I was a bit unsure about what you were going for, what you were trying to argue. I think it makes a lot more sense now. And I think that for me as a designer, it inspires me to do different things. I've been, and we've talked about this, talking a lot about the war, thinking a lot about the war in Indochina and the war in Nigeria, which are topics that I thought I would never make games about. And now, a few years in the game design, I realized that those are topics I care about and I want to make games about, but I don't want to make the same games that I've already played because I see flaws in them that makes me feel uncomfortable, and I want to approach it more critically and more interestingly, at least to my point of view. And what you're saying actually convinces me that some of the ideas that I had are not insane, and actually you're actually putting words in thoughts that I didn't really completely formalize. And for example, I was thinking about something on the war in Indochina that would focus on Dien Bien Phu, but not Dien Bien Phu the battle, Dien Bien Phu the impact that it has on the Geneva Accords. And I was thinking, well, I would like something that actually converges the two things, where Dien Bien Phu is the track and the actual game is the Geneva Accord, you could say, and twisting this thing where you would have in another game where Dien Bien Phu are actually where you're moving the cubes and everything, and the political is a small thing on the side. I wanted to flip that whole logic around and have like mechanical operational stuff that are actually tracks, but you actually mostly game the negotiation that are happening in Geneva at that time, and that you realize what is the impact on negotiation on different things that happen on the ground, and flipping the perspective. And what you say here actually makes me realize that it does make sense, but I didn't really understood why it does make sense. I had just a more an intuition, but it wasn't as clearly defined. And you taking the time to put those things together, looking at it analytically and critically, actually is very eye-opening. So I must say thanks a lot for that. That's great. So
yeah, no problem. Just to like really sell that game that Fred now is committed to doing, by the way, on Geneva. So why,
I already have a title for it.
Yeah,
It
why
would
in
be
the
called
player's mind that's important to really like encapsulate everything we've talked about is that there's so many games on Dien Bien Phu, and it's all about the Viet Minh winning such a crushing victory.
Yeah.
And then there's a question then of why didn't they get the whole country? Like, why did they have to split the country in half? And Fred's game on Geneva will tell you that. Because there's a lot more complexity going on than just the guy didn't know where to put his artillery, so he killed himself. So, which is what most Dien Bien Phu games are about, really.
And I can tell you, the game would be called an honorable exit. That would be the title of the game, and look for P500 if it will come in.
Yeah, Gene will get excited. So you'll see a teaser that says a game set in Southeast Asia, and then the very next month there'll be an honorable exit, and Fred will have to scramble to think about what's actually going to be in the game.
Yeah, put things together, and then we'll end up just making a trick-taking game again.
Yes.
Good. No, but that was really great. I must say, Stephen, thanks a lot for putting this together. I think the value of these reflections are super useful. It might be a bit heavy to watch. It's 90 minutes of like making a very structured point, but I think it has a tremendous amount of value. So thanks a lot for taking the time, answering my questions, and and thanks again for all the work that you do to actually move things forward in terms of design and representation of interstate conflict. I think it's really fascinating. So thanks again for all of that. And you can come back whenever you want. So I'm not pushing you away.
I'll have more products to sell, and then I won't talk about them at all.
But not even for products. You can come back to play games. That's the thing. That's what I miss. Yeah, like you came only for 300. I think that's the only thing.
And Conquest and Consequences, that's what it's called.
Oh yeah, you did. But it would be just nice for you to come and just teach me a game that you really like what you did for 300. Take a game that you like, and we just play it together, and we can talk about it, even if we don't go through all of it. I think a lot of the discussion that we had while we were playing Ici c'est la France, like those kind of discussions would have been super interesting.
Yes.
Like just recording a debrief after a session. It doesn't have even to be the gameplay. I think would be interesting. But just to say, you're always welcome. And always happy to have you here to discuss those topics. Thanks again, Stephen, for being here today. If you want to know the Guerrilla Generation, Stephen's latest game is available on P500 on GMT's website. I will add the link in the description. The British way should be shipping anytime when I'm releasing this video. So have a look at it. Amazing game. And there is a series of Joe and I playing through the campaign. And and see you soon. And thanks again for everything.
All right. Well,
bye, everyone.
For listening. See ya.